What if every major financial collapse in Latin America, from the Collor Plan to the Tequila Crisis to the Corralito, wasn't an isolated event, but part of the same repeating pattern we keep refusing to see? What if the region has been trapped for decades inside a six-stage financial cycle that silently grows beneath political promises, economic reforms, and temporary victories? When you look closely at the early signs, the cracks appear long before the public notices anything, and long before governments admit what is happening. The cycle always begins the same way, with distortions that look harmless, justified, even necessary. Excess liquidity, unsustainable credit expansion, artificial currency stability, and political pressures to stimulate growth at any cost. These early mechanisms create an illusion of progress, but behind them lies the same structural vulnerability that has taken down entire nations in the past. In the early stages, consumption rises, foreign capital flows in, and governments celebrate what they call a new era of stability. But beneath the surface, the foundations are already weakening. Productivity is stagnant, debt grows faster than income, and the state becomes increasingly dependent on short-term capital rather than long-term competitive strength. Latin America has lived this pattern repeatedly, from Brazil and Argentina to Mexico and beyond. And yet, every time a new administration takes power, the same promises return. Modernization, currency strength, social uplift, economic rebirth. The population believes it because they want to believe it. After years of instability, every slight improvement feels like the beginning of a miracle. But the miracle never lasts, because the mathematical structure of the cycle is already in motion long before the public feels the symptoms. You may even recognize this first stage today. A mix of optimism, denial, and political narratives that distract from the underlying fragility. And that's why understanding this hidden beginning is crucial. If you can identify the early stage of the financial cycle, you can understand the entire chain of events that follows. Before we go deeper, tell me, have you ever lived through a period that seemed stable until suddenly everything changed around you? If this opening is already making sense to you, leave a comment sharing your experience, hit the like button, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can follow the rest of this investigation as we continue unraveling the next stages of this cycle in the upcoming part. The second stage of the financial cycle in Latin America always unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, as if the system were holding its breath before the real storm begins. It is the moment when governments, pressured by political expectations and short-term demands, adopt economic measures that appear responsible on the surface, but are structurally dangerous underneath. These policies often come wrapped in sophisticated language, presented as stabilization plans, modernization efforts, or necessary adjustments to support growth. Yet behind these announcements lies a deeper truth that most citizens never see. The state begins to rely on temporary fixes, rather than addressing the core vulnerabilities that were already forming in stage 1. This is when excessive credit expansion becomes normalized, when artificially strong exchange rates are defended as symbols of national confidence, and when governments manipulate interest rates to stimulate consumption instead of productivity. Foreign investors interpret these signals as signs of stability, sending waves of capital into the economy, reinforcing the illusion that everything is under control. But in reality, dependence on external financing increases, local industries weaken, and the foundations of the economy become more fragile with each passing month. The political class, eager to maintain approval, continues supporting these choices because they delay visible pain, even if they magnify future consequences. Meanwhile, the middle class experiences rising access to credit, cheaper imported goods, and a temporary sense of prosperity. This comfort blinds society to the structural imbalances forming below the surface. Governments use this moment to push narratives of transformation, claiming the nation is finally reaching the long-awaited stability it deserves. But the numbers tell another story. Public spending grows faster than revenue, external debt climbs, and the country becomes increasingly vulnerable to global fluctuations. Small shocks that should be manageable suddenly become threats because the economic balance is artificially supported. In this stage, the political system becomes addicted to the illusion of progress. It justifies short-term interventions as pragmatic choices, even when they deepen the underlying weakness. The warning signs are there for anyone paying attention. Rising debt to GDP ratios, capital inflows that look more speculative than productive, and a government that chooses optics over restructuring. The cycle gains momentum, not because of a sudden crisis, but because the country drifts further away from long-term sustainability. And as this silent escalation intensifies, the point arrives when the system can no longer pretend stability is real, setting the stage for the next turning point where the consequences finally begin reaching the population directly, shifting the financial cycle into a far more dangerous phase. As the financial cycle enters its third stage, the pressure that once remained hidden begins to rise to the surface, slowly shifting from abstract macroeconomic indicators to the daily reality of the middle class. This is the turning point where the system's internal imbalance becomes impossible to mask, even if the government continues insisting that everything is under control. What once appeared to be temporary distortions now start affecting the very people who carried a sense of security during the earlier stages. This is when optimism fades, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty that spreads through households, businesses, and financial institutions. The first signs typically emerge in the credit markets. Banks tighten lending conditions, not because they want to, but because liquidity becomes harder to sustain. Loans that were previously approved in days now remain pending for weeks. Mortgage rates creep upward. Long-term financing becomes risky. At the same time, inflation, previously described as seasonal or transitory, starts eroding purchasing power. Salaries no longer keep up. Families reduce consumption. Small businesses struggle to maintain operations as input costs rise unpredictably. The confidence that once dominated the early stages, supported by political speeches and foreign capital inflows, begins to weaken as the reality of the underlying fragility becomes visible. Governments attempt to reassure the public by unveiling new programs, promising adjustments that will stabilize the situation. But these measures often feel disjointed, reactive rather than proactive, signaling that policymakers are losing the ability to control the narrative. Market indicators start fluctuating more aggressively. Capital that once flowed easily into the country begins to hesitate. Some investors quietly pull out, while others demand higher returns to compensate for the new risks. Currency volatility increases, and each unexpected movement triggers new waves of anxiety among businesses that depend on imports or foreign-denominated debt. For the middle class, this stage is particularly destabilizing because it challenges the belief that the system will correct itself. Savings lose value faster than anticipated. Investments that once seemed safe begin showing sudden losses. Households that had expanded their consumption in the previous stages now struggle to maintain their lifestyle. The sense of progress that surged during the artificial expansion fades, replaced by financial pressure that feels like it came out of nowhere, even though it has been building for years. This shift in collective sentiment is critical, because it marks the moment when society begins recognizing that the instability is not temporary. The early cracks widen, spreading doubts about whether the government can still control the situation. And as confidence diminishes, the cycle accelerates toward the next phase, where the erosion of trust pushes institutions into increasingly aggressive decisions that reshape the entire structure of the economy. As the cycle advances into its fourth stage, the shift is no longer subtle. What once appeared as isolated financial discomfort now becomes a broader institutional fracture that affects the collective psychology of an entire nation. Confidence, which had already weakened in the previous stage, begins to erode at a pace that governments cannot contain. This is the moment when traditional assurances stop working, when official statements lose credibility, and when society starts questioning whether the authorities truly understand the problem or are simply trying to manage perceptions. In Latin America, this stage has repeated itself so consistently that it has become almost predictable, yet every generation is caught off guard, as if encountering it for the first time. The government's actions during this stage often reveal more than the data itself. Policy measures become erratic, oscillating between attempts to calm markets and desperate efforts to regain control. One week officials promise fiscal discipline, and the next they announce new spending programs. One month the currency is defended with aggressive interventions, and the next the exchange rate is allowed to slide without explanation. These contradictions create a climate of uncertainty that amplifies fear, signaling that the system is no longer stabilizing itself but reacting to pressures it can barely contain. Even institutions traditionally seen as anchors of trust, central banks, treasury ministries, regulatory bodies, start to appear overwhelmed. Meanwhile, society feels the tension from every direction. Prices accelerate in unpredictable ways. Basic goods fluctuate weekly. Businesses pause investments, unsure how to operate in an environment where tomorrow's costs cannot be anticipated. Families begin altering their behavior in response, postponing purchases, reducing savings in local currency, protecting income by any means available. These shifts in behavior deepen the instability, not because people act irrationally, but because they respond logically to the signals the system is sending. The economy becomes a reflection of fear rather than confidence. Political narratives intensify as leaders attempt to justify the situation, often blaming international forces, previous administrations, or global circumstances. But the population, already exhausted by years of recurring crises, grows increasingly skeptical. This erosion of trust is the true hallmark of Stage 4. The moment when society stops believing in promises and begins to prepare for the worst. Government attempts to reassure only highlight how fragile the situation has become, and every new announcement is analyzed with suspicion instead of hope. The institutions that should provide stability start acting defensively, creating a feedback loop that accelerates the loss of legitimacy. It is in this fragile atmosphere that the cycle gains irreversible momentum. What began as financial imbalance has now transformed into institutional vulnerability. And once this transformation occurs, the next stage arrives quickly, carried by the weight of decisions that can no longer be postponed. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments if you have ever witnessed a moment when your country's institutions felt like they were losing control, and how that experience shaped your view of economic crises. As the financial cycle enters its fifth stage, the atmosphere becomes heavier, almost suffocating, as if the entire country were holding its breath while waiting for a blow everyone senses, but no one can predict precisely. At this point, the pressures accumulated over years of structural imbalance, political hesitation, and institutional erosion finally converge. Governments, cornered by shrinking reserves, declining investor confidence, and accelerating inflation, begin taking measures that would have been unthinkable only a short time earlier. These actions do not emerge from strategic planning or long-term vision. They arise from urgency, fear, and the need to delay a collapse that is already unfolding beneath the surface. This is when restrictions start. They rarely appear all at once. Instead, they begin subtly, almost quietly. New limits on foreign exchange purchases, new taxes on international transactions, adjustments to banking rules that seem technical but directly affect daily activity. Officials insist these measures are temporary, necessary, and harmless, framing them as the responsible alternative to external instability. But society recognizes the pattern. Latin America has lived through these moments many times, and the public instinctively understands what these signs mean. Once a government begins controlling the financial arteries of the economy, it is because the internal machinery is struggling to function on its own. The next steps often escalate quickly. Authorities implement capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country. They freeze prices or impose rigid regulations to contain inflation, even though history shows such measures rarely produce the intended results. Banks face new operational guidelines designed to protect liquidity, while businesses encounter unexpected barriers that compromise their ability to plan and invest. Slowly, the promise of open financial movement shrinks, replaced by a controlled environment in which every transaction becomes subject to government approval. The system enters a defensive stance, and this shift transforms daily life into a constant negotiation with uncertainty. In these moments, the middle class feels the impact most intensely. Savings that were already losing value now face the threat of restricted access. Investments become trapped in a system that no longer allows fluid movement. Families who once built their financial stability through predictable mechanisms suddenly find themselves navigating rules that change without warning. And while governments assure the population that these actions are necessary to protect national interests, The underlying message is unmistakable. The country has reached a point where normal functioning is no longer possible. This stage is defined not only by the measures taken, but also by the shift in collective behavior. People accelerate purchases of durable goods, fearing future shortages. They convert local currency into any alternative that feels safer. They adapt decisions not to improve their quality of life, but to minimize damage. The psychological landscape becomes one of anticipation, signaling that the transition into the most volatile part of the cycle is approaching. And as these restrictions harden, the system edges dangerously close to the moment when the instability can no longer be contained, pushing the country into the most explosive stage yet. By the time the cycle reaches its sixth stage, the crisis is no longer something building beneath the surface. It has erupted into full public view, reshaping daily life with a speed that feels both shocking and inevitable. What once appeared to be a series of technical adjustments or temporary restrictions now reveals its true nature. The system has entered a phase of open instability, and the protective layers that held it together for years are no longer strong enough to contain the pressure. In this stage, events unfold rapidly, driven by fear, uncertainty, and the sudden recognition that the financial mechanisms people depend on are no longer reliable. The first visible sign is usually a sharp move in the currency. Devaluations that were previously gradual become abrupt, leaving families and businesses scrambling to understand how overnight changes have transformed the value of everything they own. Imports become dramatically more expensive. Shelves reflect new prices that shift with every batch of goods. Inflation begins feeding on itself, moving beyond the control of the policies that once kept it contained. The banking system strains under the weight of withdrawals, currency conversions, and frantic attempts by the public to preserve whatever purchasing power remains. Governments respond with announcements that attempt to project confidence, yet the tone of these statements changes. They shift from reassurance to urgency, from promises of stability to appeals for calm, revealing how desperate the situation has become. New policies arrive in rapid succession. Emergency interest rate hikes intended to defend the currency, forced debt restructurings positioned as protective measures, unexpected banking holidays to prevent system-wide runs. Each measure is described as necessary, yet each one deepens the perception that the crisis is spinning beyond control. Institutions that once symbolized reliability now appear reactive, uncoordinated, and overwhelmed. Businesses operate with growing uncertainty. Contracts become harder to honor as costs fluctuate unpredictably. Suppliers demand upfront payments to compensate for currency losses. Employers delay decisions, unsure whether they will be able to maintain payroll next month. For the population, the crisis shifts from a financial concern to a daily reality. Families rush to secure necessities before prices increase again. Savings lose value by the hour, and long-term planning collapses under the weight of immediate survival. Even individuals who considered themselves protected through diversified income or stable employment begin experiencing the shock that ripples through every sector. What defines this stage is not just the economic breakdown, but the psychological shift that comes with it. The collective belief that the system can recover through routine adjustments evaporates, replaced by a sense that the rules have fundamentally changed. People start to view every decision, from household purchases to financial movements, through the lens of self-preservation. The pressure becomes a continuous undercurrent, shaping conversations, influencing choices, and marking the point at which society realizes it has fully crossed into the most volatile terrain of the financial cycle. And as this instability intensifies, it pushes the country toward the next phase, where fear no longer remains silent, but begins manifesting openly in ways that transform both the streets and the national identity. When the cycle advances into its seventh stage, the crisis is no longer confined to financial charts, currency fluctuations, or government announcements. It becomes visible in the streets, on supermarket shelves, in the expressions of the people who wait in long lines, and in the tension that spreads across neighborhoods as uncertainty evolves into collective anxiety. This is the moment when society reaches a breaking point, when desperation overshadows caution, and when the consequences of years of structural fragility erupt into daily life with a force that no institution can contain. The pressure that had accumulated silently now manifests explosively. Banks, already unable to meet the demands of panicked withdrawals, impose harsh restrictions that only amplify fear. People arrive early in the morning hoping to access their savings, only to find limits that shrink week after week. Rumors spread quickly, often faster than official information. Each new whisper about a banking failure, an impending freeze, or a change in access rules triggers waves of alarm that push more citizens to rush toward the same fragile system, unintentionally accelerating its collapse. The public no longer trusts announcements. They trust what they see, what they feel, what they fear. Shops that once operated normally face shortages as distribution networks collapse under the financial strain. Suppliers demand payments in foreign currency, if they supply at all. Prices change so rapidly that merchants mark products manually several times a day. In some moments, the economy becomes a barter-like environment disguised in modern clothing, where goods hold more reliability than money itself. Citizens begin stockpiling essential items, not because they are irrational, but because instability has erased the comfort of predictability. Panic buying, scarcity, and speculation form a cycle of their own, reinforcing the financial chaos at the street level. Political discourse becomes more fragmented as leaders struggle to regain control. Explanations shift depending on the audience. One day, external enemies are blamed. The next day, previous administrations carry the responsibility. But the population, exhausted by contradictions, stops listening. Protests grow, beginning as peaceful gatherings and escalating into confrontations when emotions overflow. Streets fill with people demanding answers, accountability, relief. When frustration meets hunger, when fear meets disappointment, the environment becomes volatile, and even small incidents can escalate into broader unrest. Social tension rises not only because of economic scarcity, but also because trust among citizens erodes. People worry about their neighbors, question who is hoarding, who is withdrawing money secretly, who is exchanging currency on the black market. The social fabric weakens under the weight of survival instincts. Each person protects what little they have left, while institutions fail to offer a stable alternative. What once felt like a shared national struggle slowly transforms into individual battles for protection and continuity. This stage marks the moment when fear becomes loud, public, unavoidable. It is the phase where society realizes that the crisis is no longer about numbers. It is about people, their emotions, their endurance, their breaking points. And as this collective tension intensifies, the cycle moves closer to revealing the deeper structural scars that will shape the country long after the immediate chaos ends. Before we continue, tell me in the comments if you have ever seen a moment when fear or uncertainty in your country spilled into the streets and changed the atmosphere around you. As the crisis evolves into its 8th stage, the immediate chaos that dominated daily life begins revealing its deeper consequences, carving long-lasting marks into the economic, social, and psychological foundations of the country. This is the moment when society starts to understand that financial collapses are not temporary storms that pass with time. They leave structural scars that reshape the nation far beyond the period of instability. What began as a currency shock or a liquidity shortage now becomes a transformation in how people behave, how businesses plan, and how the state interacts with its own population. In Latin America, the echoes of past crises continue to influence decisions, decades after the original events occurred, showing how each collapse leaves a lingering imprint on the collective consciousness. One of the most significant outcomes of this stage is the permanent change in trust. Citizens who once believed in the stability of their banking system now carry the memory of frozen accounts, restricted withdrawals, or devalued savings. This memory becomes generational, passed from parents to children like a warning. Never rely solely on what the government or the financial system promises. As a result, people shift their strategies. They diversify in unconventional ways, turning to foreign currencies, hard assets, or informal networks, often preferring methods that may not be efficient but feel safer. This behavior, repeated millions of times, reshapes the economic culture of the entire country. Businesses do not escape these long-term consequences either. After enduring unpredictable shocks, many adopt defensive practices that limit productivity and innovation. Instead of investing in growth, they prioritize survival, maintaining higher levels of liquidity, reducing exposure to local currency risks, and avoiding long-term commitments that might become liabilities during the next downturn. These choices, entirely rational at the individual level, create a structural drag on national development. Productivity stagnates, competitiveness weakens, and the economy becomes more dependent on external cycles rather than internal strength. Governments, too, change their behavior after such crises. The state becomes more cautious, sometimes excessively so, implementing layers of regulations intended to prevent past mistakes, but often creating rigid frameworks that hinder flexibility. Policymakers carry the memory of failed stabilization attempts, and this memory influences future decisions, making them more risk-averse even in moments when bold action is necessary. In countries with recurring crises, this dynamic becomes a cycle of its own. Each collapse reduces institutional capacity, each recovery becomes slower, and each new shock hits harder than the one before. But perhaps the most profound consequence lies in the psychology of the people. A society that has lived through financial trauma does not view money, work, or stability in the same way again. Families adjust their values. They prioritize security over ambition, caution over optimism. Young people grow up expecting crises as part of normal life, shaping dreams and choices through the lens of uncertainty. What was once considered extraordinary becomes routine, and this normalization of instability becomes one of the heaviest burdens the country carries into the future. In this stage, the crisis stops being a moment and becomes a memory, something that no longer dominates the headlines, but continues influencing every decision made by individuals, companies, and institutions. And as these long-term consequences settle into the national identity, the cycle prepares to reveal another layer, one that extends beyond the country's borders and affects how the world perceives and interacts with it. As the crisis progresses into its ninth stage, the internal damage that has reshaped the nation begins to radiate outward, altering not only domestic dynamics, but also the country's position in the global system. Financial collapses do not remain confined within national borders. They spill into trade agreements, diplomatic relationships, debt, markets, and international credibility. In Latin America, each major crisis has produced ripple effects far beyond its territory, influencing how partners negotiate, how creditors evaluate risk, and how investors perceive the entire region. At this stage, the consequences of the collapse intersect with global interests, and the country must navigate a landscape where its weakened condition becomes visible to the rest of the world. The first international impact appears in external debt relations. Creditors, already wary from missed payments or forced restructurings, begin reclassifying the country as high risk. This shift is not merely symbolic. It shapes borrowing costs for years, often decades, making access to new financing significantly more expensive. Every interest rate increase becomes a reminder of past instability. International institutions impose stricter conditions, tighter oversight, and more intrusive policy requirements, reflecting their lack of confidence in the country's ability to manage its own financial affairs. These restrictions limit economic sovereignty at a moment when the nation is already vulnerable. Trade relationships also undergo a transformation. Foreign partners hesitate to rely on a country whose currency moves unpredictably and whose internal supply chains have been disrupted. Importers and exporters on both sides encounter new obstacles, fluctuating prices, contractual uncertainties, and the need for alternative payment. Arrangements to avoid exposure to instability. Regional trade blocs observe these disruptions closely, adjusting agreements or contingency plans to prevent contagion. Even neighboring countries become cautious, knowing that financial turmoil tends to spread quickly across Latin American borders, especially where economies are interconnected through investment flows, remittances, or commodity markets. International investors respond with defensive strategies. Capital that once flowed easily into the country now seeks refuge in more stable environments. Funds reclassify assets, corporations pause expansion plans, and multinational companies reduce exposure to local currency risk. These decisions reinforce a cycle in which reduced foreign participation slows recovery, while slow recovery reinforces the perception of risk. The nation becomes trapped between the weight of its past and the scarcity of new opportunities, and this perception spreads, often unfairly, to the entire region. A crisis in one Latin American country frequently triggers re-evaluations of risk in others, as global markets treat the region as a single intertwined system. Diplomatic relations experience their own strain. Governments must renegotiate agreements from a weaker position, seeking concessions or financial support that inevitably come with political expectations. Allies may assist through loans or emergency arrangements, but such support is rarely neutral. It influences future alignments, voting, behavior in international organizations, and long-term strategic partnerships. The crisis becomes a stage where global powers exert subtle influence, shaping reforms or policies in exchange for stability. This stage reveals how deeply interconnected financial systems have become. A domestic collapse is never just domestic. It redefines how the world sees the country, and how the country must adapt in response, altering its global relationships in ways that will continue shaping the next phase of the cycle long after the immediate crisis fades. As the financial cycle reaches its 10th stage, a sobering realization settles across the country. The collapse was never a single moment, but a sequence of decisions, pressures, and reactions that built upon each other until the system could no longer support its weight. And yet, even after the most dramatic episodes fade from the headlines, the pattern continues beneath the surface, preparing itself to repeat. The most challenging truth for any nation emerging from a crisis is that recovery does not erase the structure that created the collapse. It merely resets the cycle. Leaders promise reforms, institutions attempt to rebuild credibility, and the population begins adapting to whatever version of stability emerges. But deep down, the collective memory of the trauma shapes every behavior, every policy, and every expectation. In this stage, the country tries to reclaim control while navigating the residue of instability. International organizations propose frameworks for long-term restructuring, often requiring adjustments that reshape budgets, social programs, and the role of the state. Governments, now aware of how fragile the system has become, attempt to restore trust through new regulations, transparency campaigns, or monetary strategies designed to signal discipline. However, beneath these efforts lies the acknowledgement that credibility takes years to rebuild, while fear can return in a matter of days. Each decision is made under the shadow of past failures, influencing how far institutions are willing to go and how quickly society responds. For citizens, the aftermath of the crisis becomes a mixture of vigilance and resignation. Families who saw their savings lose value adopt defensive financial habits. Businesses that survived adjust their structures to be less exposed to shocks. Younger generations inherit the psychological imprint of volatility, shaping how they plan their futures, invest their earnings, and interpret economic signals. This transformation creates a nation more aware of its vulnerabilities, yet also more cautious, sometimes to the point of slowing progress. The cycle, in many ways, becomes self-perpetuating because the fear produced by the last collapse influences decisions that prepare the environment for the next one. This is why Latin America, despite different governments, ideologies, currencies, and historical phases, continues returning to the same trajectory. The cycle is not only economic but cultural, political, and psychological. It feeds on the unresolved tensions left behind by every crisis. And understanding this pattern is the only way to break it. Recognizing the early signs, identifying when optimism turns into distortion, seeing through the political narratives that mask fragility, and understanding how society responds at each stage. These are the tools that allow a nation to anticipate the path ahead, rather than repeat it unknowingly. If you stayed with me until this point, it means this breakdown resonated with you. Before you go, consider subscribing so you can keep diving into these deep analyses that help make sense of the world we are living in. And if you reach the end, leave a comment saying, "I'm here until the last stage, so I know this message connected with you." If the insights in this video helped clarify this complex cycle, give it a like to support the work we're doing together. And when you're ready to continue, there's another video right here on the side that expands this topic even further. Click it and keep going with me.